Isha, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, David. I'm a real fan of your Science Better conversation, so it's an honor to be here, really.
Awesome, awesome. Well, you know, I hate to recount people's backstory, just especially for you, because you've done such a wonderful job telling it on everyone else's podcast. Just most recently, I think with Robert and Rachel on the Footprint podcast. But I would love for you to start just kind of maybe like a brief sketch of your story and how you got to New Harvest and how you
Sure,
view the role.
sure. Yeah, it is. It can be important context. So my background is in cell biology. I did a cell bio undergrad at the University of Alberta, which is I'm not there, but I'm in Edmonton, where the U of A is. And I decided to take a meat science class in my fourth year, which and I took it because I was like, this is biology, but why is it in a different faculty? Why is it in a different building, like across
Hmm.
campus? So I took this meat science class, and it was a graduate level class called Meat and Meat Products. Um, and I just I primarily took it because everyone can talk about meat. Like that's the kind of biology you can talk about with anyone. Whereas talking about enzyme pathways is not really as intriguing in terms of like dinner conversation. So I took it for that sole reason, I guess, to connect with people around science. And when I took it, I was just blown away hearing the impact that animal agriculture has on the world, and feeling kind of betrayed that I had never really thought of animal agriculture as something that was not holistic. And to see it actually be a very extractive thing was quite shocking, especially because Alberta is also a really big oil and gas place. And so all my attention is normally fixated on how we should be stopping the tar sands and that kind of stuff. But seeing animal agriculture be this detrimental and also not require us to completely change the way cities are built and actually focus on dietary changes or new products made me feel like, why are we not focusing more on changing animal agriculture? Um, so of course I thought we'd all go vegan. That lasted just a few weeks because I realized there's nothing I could add to that conversation, and there was, that's not a neglected conversation either. And so a few classes later, my professor mentioned the idea that, maybe one day we could grow meat from cells. And I was just like, that's exactly the thing that I'm going to do and is so important. And where are all the people doing it? Like, how can I find that community? So I fixated on that because I had the cell bio background.
Hmm.
Everyone else in my class were in kind of animal, not animal agriculture, but in the kind of food science world more proper, like veterinarians, nutrition people, that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. But I had been reading in the class prior about tissue engineering, and then coming into this class talking about how we could grow meat, and like, this is obviously where it all comes together. Um, so I wrote a big paper about it, and my professor loved it. I sent it to New Harvest because New Harvest actually existed for a long time before I showed up. It was around since 2003. And the founder of New Harvest, Jason Matheny, who was it was kind of like a single page website with a whole bunch of links of like where you could read more about cultured
Hmm.
meat. I emailed it to him saying, you can put this on your website if you want. And he said, this is such a great paper. He emailed me back, CC'd half the scientists. And so I felt like I was already surrounded by this community of people who are like evaluating the paper, reading it, suggesting it, what should be done, like doing a peer review really with me in the room. And I just felt like, wow, this group welcomed me in. They didn't ask how old I was, where I came from, who I worked with, because I didn't
Right.
work with anyone and I was very young and all these things. And I felt like it was just such a cool thing to be part of. And I've really tried to carry that energy forward with New Harvest. So to shorten the rest of the story, what happened after is I became fixated on the idea of running New Harvest. It didn't have any full-time staff when I first encountered it. And several
Hmm.
years later, I was able to make that happen. And I've been running New Harvest ever since
You,
2013.
it's funny because I heard in another podcast the story of how you got that, of how you kind of
Oh,
played
yes.
Jason off of the TED Talk and the TED Talk off of Jason.
Yes.
And then I went and watched the TED Talk, and it's really astounding. I mean, I think, it's something that I think was really clear is you just had a lot of energy and excitement to bring to this idea and this field, which
Hmm.
really needed that.
I
And
actually, I actually think a line on my resume was like, "What I lack in experience, I make up for in enthusiasm." Like I remember writing that, and I'm glad you mentioned that TED Talk because I have another TED Talk coming out this time, not
mm,
a TEDx, but an actual TED main stage talk in about a month from now, and it's been really cool thinking about how 10ish years have elapsed and how much has changed and how these like two talks are kind of coming at these different phases in my career and also in terms of CalAg's history. I mean, when I gave that first TED talk, the first TED talk, I'm kind of talking about dietary choices and how, it's not about if you're vegan or not, it's about how much meat you eat. And you can make that choice every meal. And what if you had this option to eat cell cultured meat and it hit, checked all these boxes. But now my TED talk that's coming out next month is more about like, it is here. Like there are 100 companies now. There were 0 companies when the first talk came out.
mhm.
There's over $1 billion of investment. There was $0 of investment when the first talk came out. Now it's about, okay, the field is being built. How do we focus on maximizing the impact of this technology? How do we think about New Harvest as a steward for technology and recognize that technology in itself is not good or bad? It becomes good or bad or has these good or bad impacts based on the pressures around it and the infrastructures around it. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of your previous. I have the book here, the standards book. The other podcast about standards, because standards is really what brings that in the
Yes.
broad sense, and norms and all these kinds of things.
So,
So
so the book is
yeah,
Engineering Rules. Joanne Yates and,
yes,
and Craig Murphy have got the other interview up. Okay, so I think that sums it up pretty nicely. I think Cell Ag was very nascent 10 years ago, and now
hmm
we're all of a sudden in this kind of booming economy and science, and it's just a really vibrant scene, and you're at the center of it. And what's I want to like also just like warn the anyone who's listening to this that I'm actually less interested in talking to you about cellular agriculture and way more interested to talk to you about field building
and
because it's some
that's why I'm so excited to have this
right
conversation. Yes.
because it's something that I've been a part of kind of loosely in this kind of ocean tech and conservation tech space, um,
hmm
also for the past 10 years.
hmm
And I'm at a similar moment where I'm kind of looking at the like 10 years of work going, interesting, like we accomplished something. But the other thing that I found is having that perspective as someone who actually does want to grow the field and build the field and is committed to that.
hmm
There's no books about this, right? There's hardly any role models. There are role models, but you have to kind of search for it because there's no term for this field building, or cultural entrepreneurship is another term I like to use. But you're like me, where like I think you've started a couple of companies now too, right?
Yes, but that was kind of a side effect of the field building intention.
Right. Okay, cool. Yeah, me too. Like we're both committed to this bigger idea, moving
Yes.
conversations forward, moving culture forward.
Yes.
And company building is part of that. We can talk about that later. Um,
Mhm.
who were your role models in this kind of cultural entrepreneurship, this field building work? Do you have any? Did you have any when you were getting started?
Interesting. Um, no one is coming to mind, although I'm sure I do have some role models. But I have lately been thinking a lot about how the experiences that I have. Here's my son, Marcel.
Welcome.
You want to say hi? Okay, that's okay. um, thank you. It's probably hungry. I'll come back. Um,
Or another way to think about that question instead of the role
yes.
models is, when did you recognize that that was your job? Like when did it dawn on you that that was actually the work that we were doing? Did you know that when you set out, when you started that new harvest, or did it kind of reveal itself to you during the process?
Um, I knew that from the beginning. I may not have known it in those words, but I knew it from the beginning because I remember sitting at my laptop,
Mhm.
thinking like, "Oh, does the idea of CellAg actually?" It wasn't even called CellAg back then, but does this idea end when I close my laptop? Like, does it continue to live on in the world and in spirit and stuff when my laptop is closed? And so, for me, it was really about, I was inspired by a few different things. Are you able to hear him, by the way?
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. It's all good.
Okay, good. I was inspired by a few different things. One is I did do a little bit of work in pharma, and pharma is ecosystem work because I worked at GlaxoSmithKline in policy and public affairs. And in that department in particular, we were at the intersection of nonprofit work who were advocating for certain things with government.
Mhm.
Uh, Obviously, the for-profit that we were at, and academia, and government too. And we were kind of all working together because biotechnology is so expensive. It takes $1 billion to bring a single molecule drug to market, and so
Mhm.
many different hands and so many different owners, and it's like passing along this pipeline for over 10 years. And that was the context that I came into CellAg with, is like, this is what the infrastructure looks like. It's like huge infrastructure that requires so many different people with so many different talents, so much different type of money, so much different types of incentives. So that was a big part of my inspiration. A second part of my inspiration is from just like growing up in a small city and being part of like the local music scene. My husband is a musician that I met in Edmonton. It was a really ripe all ages scene, and because of the size of our city, you would be dabbling in all kinds of different music at different times. And the point of this is you see that scenes expand and contract, with it come and go. And so you see, at the beginning there's this group of like people who are really into something, and it's something that's really different, and it attracts a lot of people who are like-minded. And then eventually you reach this like tipping point where you attract people who are kind of not into it, but into the clout and into like everything that comes with being part of the thing. And then there's a layer of fans, and then it expands, and then it kind of implodes. And so I think about that for CellAg too, because I think right now is such a great time because it's still hardcore fans. Like, the people who are doing CellAg are not in it for the money. Even all the 100 companies that exist, like, a lot of them know this is really hard science that I don't know how you can even fundraise for because it's really hard, and they just know that the work is just so important, and they're kind of, we'll figure it out later how it actually, hits store shelves and everything. But it kind of reminds me of the, you know I don't know if it was earlier this week that we saw that company Colossal raise $15 million to bring back mammoths.
Mhm.
What's the return on investment for those companies? Something similar to the return on investment for a cultured meat company, in my
Mhm.
opinion. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. That's
Mhm.
not a terrible thing, because that's where we need to go. But sorry, to come back to your thing about inspiration. Yeah, my husband is a musician and DJ. He's been in lots of different bands and stuff, and I would help him throw parties and everything. And rallying together people to be excited to come to a party is pretty much the same as like doing a research project. It's like, you have to go have one-on-one conversations with people, invite them, make the case for why this thing's going to be so great, going to be even better if you're part of it. See you there, make sure they, have all the information to get there, make sure when they're there, the experience is awesome. Like, party hosting is what field building is, just on a different scale, in my opinion.
I love that. I love that. I think
Yes.
that's so relevant. Are you
Actually, I
feel
do have one inspiration now that
okay,
I'm talking, is Joey Ito, who was the director of the MIT Media Lab.
sure.
He has brought together such an interesting group of researchers who created this really dynamic space with a lot of diversity of research. And when I one of the early times I met him, I learned that his previous job was essentially being a DJ at this club called Smart Bar in Chicago, and he talked about how, culture is so much more important than rules. That was a direct quote for him
Mhm.
in making sure that the bar felt good all the time. Like, you needed it to be diverse enough that everyone was there and no one was taking over, but you also needed it to be, welcoming. So even if you were a misfit, you felt like you were surrounded by other misfits. And I think that
Mhm.
for me, that's a big part of my work, is I want everyone to feel like a misfit together rather than um, uniformly thinking.
Joey was one of the first backers of our Kickstarter project when we launched it, 10 years ago. And it was just this nascent
Oh,
underwater drone project. And we were in the garage really. And he said, "This is a cool project, keep going." And he's, of course, famous, like way higher status than we had. And I'll never forget it. That kind of stuff really matters.
yeah.
And I want to talk more about this kind of small grant stuff later. Um, but you said something interesting. Are you familiar with the term Scenius, the Brian Eno term? So
No.
Brian Eno, the musician, came up with this term called scenius. It's like a genius that arises through like scenes and groups of people.
Yeah.
And this is something that happens in science. It happens in art. It happens in
Hmm.
music. Um, these scenes come together, and these people, start sharing ideas, and they're interested in impressing each other. It's not for the money. It's for the beauty of whatever they're doing. And
Hmm.
Kevin Kelly wrote about this, and he's like, no one knows how to manufacture Scenius. It's like a really hard thing to do. The best thing you can do
Hmm.
is not kill it when it starts. And
Hmm.
you talked about this because it does seem that these things happen in space and time, they grow, and then they kind of implode. And I think, this happens for a lot of reasons. Usually it's because people show up just because they want to make a lot of money
Hmm.
off of it. And then the interesting people who were there at the beginning leave. Um,
Yep.
but that entrepreneurship actually is a really important component to the vibrancy. And so, um, you know, you're at this moment now where this is really, it's like to me, it seems like a really interesting time for CellAg. How do you
Hmm.
think about um, party curating, to use your term, at this moment? Because it seems to me it's a balance between science, between entrepreneurship, between advocacy. How do you think about that balance? And then how do you try to strike the right tone? Is that something you're actively doing?
Yeah, right now I'm really thinking about it because I think scenes die because sociopaths enter it. And they enter it because it's cool. I mean, it's just, and then it just becomes so uncool. I mean, we see that happen with all kinds of things that I won't reference by name. But yeah, things are cool until they're not, and they're usually not cool because they're so big that the message or the mission is completely diluted. And so the importance of this particular moment in CELAC is making the message and the mission something that we are committed to with a accountability structure in place. So for me, I think that is introducing some kind of standard or norm or accord that we all sign off on, that's like, we are doing this work because we want to ABC. And I mean, I could fill in some ABCs from my mind, but I think that's something we would have to collectively generate. But for me, I mean, one thing is we actually need to make a better world for animals. We actually have to have a better impact on climate change. And we probably want to have a positive impact on public health too. Um, but there's so many more things than that, and so I don't want to prioritize that. I think creating a better world for workers in the food industry is another one. And then we have to unpack each of those and say, like, what are the small things that we can do that are measurable yeses or nos that we're going to commit to? And one, for me, really low hanging fruit is the use of fetal bovine serum in cultured meat products. Like, that's always the thing the media pops up um, with, is like, oh, but what about FBS? Like, they're using an animal product in culturing cells. And it's like, yes, we are, but there's a lot of companies that have moved away from it. there are a lot of alternatives to it. And the real reason we use FBS is one of those quirks of science where you just use something because it works, not because you actually know how or why or have even questioned it. It's literally a medium to answering scientific questions, and we haven't evaluated the medium. So um, making a commitment like we will not have FBS in any of our products, to me, is an important commitment that we could get buy-in from today, and I don't think we could get buy-in from that in the future. And so it's kind of like, how do we bring together all of those like geeks? I'm actually referencing like specific blog posts about movement scene building that I will find for you later. But how do
Right.
we get these geeks all together and like create some rules of engagement so that when
Mhm.
the other groups come in, we're holding ourselves to a high standard that others could hopefully hold themselves to as well.
I love it. And to me, so again, like I'm in a similar space, right? Like we were building Ocean Tech for a long time and kind of had these similar experiences where it's like, okay, what can we actually do here that's going to move the needle for everybody? That's going to raise the tide for everybody's ship. And it came down to kind of some of these really simple little things around,
Mhm.
you know, the 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 book that they wrote really the title is perfect, Engineering Rules. And you
Yes.
realize that when you go and you look back, it's like actually small groups of engineers getting together and deciding the standards by which the world is built. It is one of the most powerful tools we have for
Mhm.
shaping culture and shaping civilization. Um, and not a lot of people take it seriously. And that's one of the things that Joan and Craig said is, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, like standards building was something that a lot of people took, like serious entrepreneurs, serious engineers, they kind of prided themselves in actually participating in those discussions. And
Mhm.
something I've been thinking about is like, how do we bring back that ethic? Something that I hear a lot in conversations is people say this, I think without thinking about it, they're like, well, I think the best way to change the world is by having a big company and then giving
Yeah.
like money back. And it's like, okay, yeah, like entrepreneurship is important and go ahead and make a lot of money, whatever. But like a lot of people take that axiom as like a fundamental truth. And I think that's a relatively new thing, and I actually don't think it's true. And one thing
Mhm.
I'm trying to promote is this idea of standards building as an ethic that you have throughout your career, not just when you get, a lot of money, that you can do this, like you did when you were
Mhm.
just starting your
Mhm.
career. This is
Yeah.
something you can do. What ideas do you have for encouraging and promoting this ethic more broadly?
I don't know because the being excited about being a standards entrepreneur, to borrow from that book, is hard because it's kind of thankless. Um,
It
it's
really is.
people who don't have there's no real title for, I mean, even standards entrepreneur, that was the first time I heard it was reading that book. Um, um, they kind of disappear into history because they're really so interested in being the mortar between the bricks rather than being the bricks. And
Mm.
starting a huge company and then making gigantic donations, like we celebrate that in our society. We don't celebrate these people who facilitate connection or facilitate leadership. And in within New Harvest, we talk a lot about facilitative leadership compared to like visionary leadership or operational leadership as this really missing piece of like, how do you create the comfortable room um, where ideas can flourish and things actually happen and get figured out. It's usually not actually about telling people what to do, and actually about a little bit of party hosting, making sure everyone's comfortable, making sure, oh, that person's really cool, they should meet that person because they could work on this together. And having that knowledge to rise above knowing what the needs are of the field, and then also the talents of all the individual people, and like who would work well with who and what would work well with this, that is really not celebrated. It's very hard to celebrate. And um I don't know how to bring people into that because the glory of it is such a distributed word of mouth glory. You can't take credit for it. In fact, you must not take credit for being a facilitative leader, because then you're not a facilitative leader anymore.
Mhm.
Because it's different saying, I want to go to this party where 50 people figured out the safety of cultured meat, versus saying, I want to go to Isha's party.
Mhm.
I wouldn't want to go to Isha's party. I would want to go to the party where all 50 of us were side by side doing this thing together.
I totally agree with you, and it's shocking to me how thankless and
Yeah.
this work is. Here's my idea, and this
Okay.
is, I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
So my hero in this work is Stuart Brand. I don't know if you know Stuart.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I mean, anyone can Google him, and there's a new documentary out about him. To me, he's the master cultural entrepreneur, right? Like, he's the blueprint of how to do this. He's just at these scenes all the time, and he's playing this kind of role that you and I are talking about, of getting things going, making things interesting and introducing
Mhm.
people to each other. Stuart has made a life doing this, and he goes from scene to scene to scene to scene. He always leaves before the party's over. And I've heard him talk about this. It's just like, he says it's because he just gets bored. Like, his aversion to boredom is the reason he goes on to the next thing. But he's built an extraordinarily interesting life. And so
Mm.
I think the way that I'm looking at this kind of career is, for me, it's not about maximizing return on investment, right? There are better ways to make a lot of money. What's interesting to me is that I think that pursuing this type of career path is a way to maximize a return on interestingness, to have a really interesting
Yes.
life.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of how I'm trying to promote this and talk about
Mhm.
it, because what I think we
Mhm.
need is a lot more standards entrepreneurs, cultural entrepreneurs, heading off in lots of interesting directions to build the future. I mean, I think
Yep.
this is how we do it. And um, anyways, that's my idea. And I think, like, part of that is building connections between folks like us, so that we have friendships and we're able to share this kind of interestingness of our different worlds, and make it more valuable and like a higher social status for other, like, cultural entrepreneurs to kind of do this. So that's my hypothesis and theory. What do you think?
I love it. And recently someone asked me, like, what do you want your legacy to be? And I was like, I'm just in it for the stories. I'm just in it for meeting people, the relationships, and the stories at the end of it. Which sounds like I don't care about climate change. Obviously, I care about all of that too. But there is a world in which this technology doesn't work out, and I still think it would be completely worth it, and I would never regret it, just because of all the people I've been able to meet and work with and see become empowered, and like the stories that I've been able to be part of and witness, like that. I agree with you. Like, that is the motivation. And um there is something else that you mentioned that I can't recall exactly, but Stuart is interestingly top of mind because his partner Ryan Phelan and I were connecting at TED also, like, just last month, and I feel like she's a field builder as well.
No doubt about it. Also a big
Yes,
hero of mine.
and we really, like, connected on a lot of things, and she was like, it feels like we're on sister paths right now, which meant so much to me. Um, because, she's trying to make a new science happen as well. So anyway, that just
Not
came to mind.
trying,
But
actually is doing it.
yes, yes, true. Trying and is. Um, and then another thought I had was, I think it's the designer Bruce Mao who said
Hmm.
that good design is invisible. Um, it made me feel like, yes, good facilitative leadership is invisible too. Because really, you see people carry on these ideas and thoughts into the world as if they are their own, and you have to kind of be happy with it living on, and the legacy being that the idea lives, not that the credit is always coming back to you. Oh, my tail.
Hi. Hi.
Hey, sweetie.
That's awesome. So one of the things, like to, like to bring it back down to earth. So like talking about these kind of bigger ideas and cultural entrepreneurship. Um,
Yes.
one of the things we're working on together is this idea of small grants, right? Like you guys have been
Yes.
doing this for a while. I've gotten into this recently through the Experiment Foundation work that we're doing. Um, and the reason I'm doing it is because we got a small grant when we got started. We got a small $7,000 grant that got us up to the starting line, that got us, we didn't even get out of the garage with that, but we got onto Kickstarter and started our company from there. Um,
Hmm.
and I know the importance of like small amounts of money and just somebody saying, I believe in you.
Yes. We talk about that a lot in New Harvest, and we shared this video recently, which I'll also share with you, about the idea of the first fan and how
Yeah.
they're more important than, the person who gives you the most money, maybe, because
Hmm.
they build the excitement and energy for the thing that you're doing, but also they empower that person with their first idea. That is so huge.
Hmm.
Encouraging that first person saying what you're doing is amazing and important, it means so much. And the video that we have about the first fan is actually like a video of a guy dancing at a festival alone.
Oh,
And
sure. Yeah.
one other
Familiar with
guy
that one.
comes, yeah, and he starts dancing, and then all these other people start, like, that is a huge thing. And I think small grants is one way of doing it. Also, just having a personal relationship with people and being like, what you're doing is awesome and matters is great. So I loved your story about Joey funding the ocean thing, because
Mhm.
he's really great at that too.
Totally. So, it reminds me of this kind of broader theme of science better, of like, how do we actually improve science? And kind of the thesis
Mhm.
with this Science Angel project on Experiment is that science has enough gatekeepers. A lot
Yeah.
of people like peer review, shutting people down. That how do we increase more of that dynamic? So, anyways, that's the kind of idea. And I think it's really good. So, I won't post this until we announce our project, but what other lessons do you guys have? Because we're just starting this, what lessons do you have for us at the Experiment Foundation, having, done this small grants program for a while? What are some of the best practices with that might not be obvious?
So I agree with you that there are so many gatekeepers in science, and I actually think the whole structure of science is very problematic, because the peer-to-peer energy is actually prevented. And at some point, science became so highly privatized, and IP became such a thing, and we incentivize people having only one idea per person. We don't want scooping. Why not publish every same publication too? And then you can have like a cohort of experts building a thing together. There's these things that we make routine in science that are about competition, which should never have been about competition. I don't think exploratory science should never be about competition. And so when I think about the small grants program, I'm excited about the prospect of giving grants that just kind of are that first fan grant. But some best practices that we've explored are, how do we just support an individual first and their project second? Because we all know that when you apply for a grant, it's very theoretical. You're kind of like, oh, what would I do with $5,000? But then when you get the $5,000, you're like, oh my God, I have to do something meaningful. And your context might change. Like, you probably were going to do deeper research than you did when you were preparing the proposal, not knowing if you're going to get it. And so we like the idea of funding that individual and being like, I love what you're thinking about. I love the path you're on. But once you get this money, here you have some flexibility, because things are going to change. And I feel like supporting the person instead of the project is really important in terms of nurturing that, like, essentially the spirit of science, which is that it is an evolving, emergent strategy, that we have to actually embrace that instead of restrict it. And I will say that funding individuals is really hard. It's just like structurally hard to do in the world that we live in. We've tried all kinds of interesting contract things with academia. It's it's very tough. And then the second thing is for everything to be open access, and that's also really hard in the world that we live in. Not spiritually. Most people do want to work open, but structurally, it's been hammered out of us since the Bayh-Dole Act
Hmm.
allowed. Yep. And then the third thing is actually fostering community. And, a lot of people will say community is dumping a bunch of people into a Slack channel. It's not that. The community actually needs that facilitative leader to make sure people are connecting with one another and getting value from it. I mean, a community is only as live as the value that any one person gets from it. And being that good host that gets people talking, celebrates when people have something to celebrate, commiserates when things aren't going wrong. That is so important for science and for scientists, just like mental health.
Yeah, totally. Can I
Yeah.
ask you a question, like for you, because you are a scientist, you studied science, you presumably you were at the bench. What was the thinking then and now about like the career path in science or academia?
I love this question, and that's such an important and great question. So I did work in the lab for about 3 months in the meat science lab of the poultry science professor who told me about the idea of cultured meat. And I was working on a project on how to make meat from egg-laying hens like more functional for meat eating. So we actually don't eat chicken from egg-laying chickens. It gets thrown away. And that's because the meat is really poor quality. And so we were trying to change it with enzymes. I kept getting so frustrated and going back to him, being like, "Can I change my project? Can I rethink everything?" Like, he's like, "No, the funder wants the project done a certain way." And maybe that actually inspired the funding people first and project second, because I remember feeling just stuck with like a dumb thesis. And I'm like, this is not the question that needs to be asked. This is not the important question to ask. Um, but there were a couple of reasons why I left the lab. One was just general frustration of being there. Um, the second was I wrote this paper and went on to publish it with my professor. And before I published it, I wrote it and thought it was so awesome about, possibilities for producing cultured meat. And he was like, "This is so great, we should publish it." And I went to my parents and I was like, "He wants me to be a master's student and I'll get a PhD in this." And they're like, "Don't, you don't want to be a PhD student." They're like, "You're going to be spending all of your time asking for money." And so it's so funny that now I spend all of my time asking for money, but for like way more people than myself. So they kind of discouraged me from entering academia. But on the same hand, I was like, yeah, why do I have to become a student if I've already written the paper? Like, let's just publish this paper. So there was also a little bit of rule breaking that happened early on in my academic career where I published this paper while I was actually like working at a respiratory therapy clinic and working on the side and being like, oh, I didn't know you could publish stuff if you were just like any old person. Turns out you can. So yeah, my escape from academia comes from a deep respect of people who are good at the lab, because I did witness a lot of researchers who are like incredibly diligent and making important, discoveries.
Mhm.
I was not that person. My mind was not set up for it. And, I wanted to be like chatting and stuff with the other people in the lab and
Mhm.
finding out where they came from, what they were working on, and how it all fit together, and less kind of focused on what I had to do. And so it was kind of just me finding what was right for me, but then also finding how could I celebrate, the scientists who do science the way that we imagine that it is done.
That makes good sense. I love that. The last question I always ask everyone it probably overlaps with a lot of the things we've talked about, but what are your ideas for making science better?
So many things. First, we have to get rid of Bayh-Dole Act and return science to being like an exploratory thing where the return on investment is there. It's just hard to measure. And that maybe that's one of the great kind of conflicts of science, is that it is so rigorous, but the impact of it is so hard to measure. it's such a metrics oriented thing, and then it's really not a metrics oriented thing. I think another thing is you know, I I actually think we should think of scientists as like first candidates for a universal basic income. It's kind of like how we think of, I think artists are also great candidates for universal basic income, but artists and scientists are really similar. Like they're very, very creative, um, ways of working, but we treat them like we want an input and an output, and that's not always productive, and that only really incentivizes one type of working and not, big collaborative projects or really exploratory projects. And, I'm really curious about what it would look like if we had a universal basic income for cell ag, um, especially for researchers. And people might argue that science is kind of like that, but I don't think it's like that, just with how grants are dispersed. And then, um, oh my gosh, I don't know what else.
Don't, that's a
I'm
lot.
I'm
That's a good.
coming from okay. I'm coming from the context of like being pretty frustrated with universities these days.
Mhm.
Um, you know, we just want to fund research at universities that remains open access, and we want our researchers to be able to talk to one another. And that is really hard to get a university to agree to, which is crazy. Like
Mhm.
universities are really still have the PR of being these like open knowledge enterprises when they're really corporate structures, and it's really hard to do creative things within them.
Here, here. Well,
Yeah.
this is so great. I really appreciate the time, and I'm glad to be on this field building journey with you and to make this connection, build this
Yes.
league of field builders. Um, and cheers to maximizing the return on interesting.
Yes, absolutely.